Let's face it, it's easy to complain about what all of those TV shows and movies that are adapted from our favorite books do wrong. And in light of all of the recent book adaptations that are coming out this year, I wanted to challenge myself and you guys into seeing if we could come up with an objective criteria for how to judge if a book adaptation is done well. Let's see how we do. All right, let's talk about a couple of points of clarification and some assumptions before we get into this. The first thing that we have to talk about is whether a book adaptation is good really is a totally different question than whether or not it did well in the box office or whether or not you thought it was a good movie or TV show. So remember that we're trying to be objective and we're just looking at how it's actually adapted. I also want to say that I think an adaptation is very different and held to different standards than something that's like inspired by. That is allowed to have a lot more changes to the main story or characters than something that is labeled as an adaptation. Lastly, I want to make sure you guys know that I don't have this criteria all put together, and that's the challenge. I want you to listen to the criteria that I have to present. There's 4 of them, and I want you to help me refine these criteria. I want to see if we can actually make this better, and we can come up with a way to, as objectively as possible, judge whether an adaptation is a good adaptation or not. Now we need to get into some assumptions before I get into the criteria. The biggest assumption I have is that in making a screen adaptation of a book, changes are not only going to be inevitable, but also required. Hear me out. I have 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that books and film or shows are fundamentally different media, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. And that if you just took the exact screenplay of the book, word by word, line by line, scene by scene, it would lose some of its soul. And it would be an incredibly boring adaptation movie show to watch. Boring! A lot of times, what we can get away with in books, things like internal monologue and the character's imagination and their internal struggles are going to be something that is incredibly interesting in a book, but would be a very boring TV show or movie. So we have to make some changes for pacing and to keep the viewers engaged with the story. There are also a lot of things that don't translate well depending on the author's narrative style. Things like flashbacks are probably easy to do in a movie, whereas if we have a character who's lying and they're saying something in their head where they're saying, I'm going to say this so that way they give me what I want, but I really mean these things and I'm struggling with this lie and therefore I'm a good person, that doesn't always come through on a TV show, especially because it would give the game away, right? So because these are so fundamentally different, there's so many other details that I think books can do so much better. We also have ourselves that are consumers of books that bring our subconscious preferences and our imagination to the story that is always going to trump other people's preferences and imagination. Whereas a team of people who have to make the decisions about lighting and color palette and what does the cantina look like behind the character as they have this conversation, that is something that is a part of a book adaptation, movie or TV show. That is not something that we get always in the details of the books. And we're not necessarily missing those details, but we have to create what's on the poster behind the character. What are other people doing or acting like? What are they wearing? All of those are different things and they build a different kind of world. And so changes are both inevitable and required. Now, we also have to talk about the purpose of an adaptation. Remember that we're not just taking a book and putting it on a TV. Why would we do that? It's really about bringing that story to a broader audience. People who don't like to read.
You want something to read?
No, I'm good.
People who haven't encountered that author. We want to bring that story or that idea or those characters to the masses. So we're trying to broaden or expand the audience of the original work. And that's one of the reasons why book adaptations can be so exciting. at least in my opinion. That also means that an adaptation fails, and this is my assumption, if the entire purpose of the adaptation is a money grab. That's right, I'm looking at you, The Hobbit. Did you really need 3 installments? Did you? Because I don't think so.
It is the gold.
That was a super hard money grab. Anyway, unpopular opinion. Now let's get into these criteria. The very first criteria, can the adaptation stand alone? What I mean by this is, if you watch a book adaptation on the screen, do you have to have somebody who already read the work whispering over your shoulder, explaining to you the significance of all of the scenes or what the ending really meant? Or can you actually understand it as its own work all by itself? Now remember that you don't have to get every single detail or every single scene perfect, but you should be able to give me a general gist of what happened without trying to have to go look up or read the original work. Now, I think some really good examples of this are adaptations that people either didn't know were an adaptation and they were super popular, they formed their own fandoms. For example, movies like Jurassic Park or cult classic Blade Runner were fantastic adaptations in that they could stand alone, and they created their own fandoms that weren't even aware that they were originally books to begin with. Example of a book adaptation that did a terrible job of this is the movie Ender's Game. I think that this was a terrible adaptation for many reasons, but the biggest one is that you didn't understand what was going on in the story if you hadn't already read the work. Now, the second criteria is, does the adaptation bring new readers to the original work or broaden out the audience of that original work? So I think a incredible success in this, the one that really set the standard that's probably never going to be repeated again, is Harry Potter. Now remember that several books had already been published before that movie came out, but when that first movie came out, it started this worldwide phenomena of so many people going out and getting the books, and then they would go to the movie, and then they would stand in line for the new books, and then they would go to the new movie, and it was this beautiful cycle of the adaptation on screen bringing new readers to the book and broadening out the audience. Another really good example of this that's happening right now is Dune. This new Dune adaptation is really bringing a lot more readers to the original work of Dune by Frank Herbert. Not only did a lot of people go out and read the book before they watched the first movie, but now that the second one is coming out, Dune sales have really increased. And we see that in the stores. All the stores bring the Dune to the forefront. Everybody knows somebody who has bought Dune because of the movies, and they're trying to read the initial work of Dune, the first book, before they go see the new installment of Dune. That is, in this criteria, a very successful adaptation because it's breeding new readers to the original work. Now we have to get into criteria number 3, which is a little bit more nuanced. Does the adaptation do the original work justice? And I think there are 2 parts of this. The first is, does it keep to the central theme or the original spirit of the book? And then the second part of this is, does it have that essence or soul of what made fans of the original work love it in the first place? Now, I get that this is starting to be a little bit more subjective. I understand that. This criteria isn't perfect. But there is some kind of X factor that you want to see in that adaptation that was present for you in the book. Again, I'm not sure how to take the subjectivity out of this, but my best examples of these 2 subsections of this criteria is Fahrenheit 451. What do we mean by central theme or thesis? In the book Fahrenheit 451, we have this theme or thesis of censorship of knowledge and censorship of new ideas in the form of books that are being withheld from the public. They're socially spurned and they're burned, and it's not acceptable to have new ideas and new information in the form of a book. If you made an adaptation of Fahrenheit 451 that did not include that actual thesis, then you would have a failed adaptation. Now, what is the essence or the X factor of what made the original fans love the original work? Now, that's going to be different for every single adaptation, but for an example, I'm going to use The Princess Bride. That story was fantastic and fable and lovable, and there's a lot of things in there that you could say were the central theme, but the essence or the X factor for me was really the sense of humor of the different characters in the story, and I think that the adaptation did a fantastic job of bringing that out in the movie. I'm not sure exactly if that would apply to every adaptation, but I do think that there has to be the element that the original work brought that made people fall in love with it that has to be present in the adaptation. And finally, this is going to bring us to criteria number 4. Now this one, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with the wordsmithing of it. So if you have some suggestions for me, I need your help. Let me know, please. The 4th criteria is: did the changes made to the adaptation add to or subtract from the characterization of the story or the thesis as a whole? And I think in order to explain this a little bit more, we have to talk about whether or not updating a work is something that is required. A lot of directors of adaptations talk about updating a work by bringing current social themes or cultural values into the work. And sometimes that can be done really well, and sometimes that takes away from the actual story. One of my examples of this is Wheel of Time by Amazon Prime. This was an example of a story that the producers said they wanted to update and cause less sexism or something of that nature. And yet we have a story where magic exists and it comes from 2 different wells, if you will. Females pull from one well and males pull from the other. However, in this world, the plot has a lot to do with the fact that the male well of magic has been tainted. So any man who develops an affinity for magic goes insane and eventually kills everyone around him. So most magic users who are men in this world have to be killed. And the entire theme or plot of this story is, can they clean the well of the magic that men draw from magic? So in the world, women are the only ones with reliable magic in the world. However, for the adaptation, they decided that that was somehow sexist. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but they put the magic wells together, therefore saying that anyone could pull magic from this well, but then they never really explained why women are the only one in the story that have magic and why men are having such a hard time or even being killed off if they show any kind of affinity for magic. And it continues to get a lot more convoluted from there, which is one of the biggest missteps of an adaptation maybe ever. Like, did they even read the story? I don't know.
I've always wanted to do that.
This is an example of a major change of updating social cultural values in an adaptation that did not work. However, there are lots of other examples of this that do work. And most of those are going to be controversial because you have to then decide what are cultural and social values that you want to support and not. And do those values, additions or subtractions, add to or take away the essence of the story? I know that some controversial examples might exist out there, like Harry Potter and the Cursed Child was adapted for the Broadway play, and the producers or whoever's in charge of casting cast a black female as a character, Hermione. She happened to be a fantastic singer, and if you don't know, it is a musical. Some people said that that took away from their experience, but other people said it did not, and there's a lot of controversy and question around whether that really took away from the essence of the story or not. A really fantastic example of updating a work to this current day and age that I think did a really good job is not science fiction or fantasy. It's actually Romeo and Juliet. This is one of those Shakespearean plays from the 16th or 17th century or something that poor high school students everywhere have to struggle through to understand. And when they made a movie about it, they used actors like Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, and they updated the technology in the world of Romeo and Juliet, I think placing it in downtown LA with characters who wear jeans and are in gangs, they drive cars, they do drugs, and they have guns. And yet somehow this adaptation really works. I don't think it takes away from anything that Shakespeare put into it, and it doesn't really subtract from the main characterization of the book. So let me know in the comments section down below if you can help me with that last criteria. What are some good examples? How can we phrase it better and be, less inflammatory also? I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes or push my opinions onto you. I'm just looking for a way to try to better gauge, is an adaptation a good one or not? I want to leave you with a final question. Can we adequately gauge or judge adaptations on screen if we haven't actually consumed the original work? Thanks so much for listening to my rant video. And now it's time for me to go watch Dune Part 2. I can't wait. So until next time.